Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So I would welcome everyone to the September edition of the New York Space Business Roundtable. We are having a conversation about the Cislunar Economy. Some of you may have noticed that we spelled it Cislunar, capital C-I-S, hyphen, and then we spelled it Cislunar, capital C, lower I-S, hyphen, and then we spelled it Cislunar, all one word. This topic is so new that there's a bazillion different ways to spell it. We haven't settled on a convention yet. And so we're going to unpack this topic a little bit today. We have a great program set up, and so we're off to the races. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Lou, and he can tell us a little bit about our topic.
Thank you, Tamara, and welcome everyone to the one-year anniversary of the New York Space Business Roundtable. We're delighted that you're back and joining us again as we move into the fall and take a 3-month journey to the moon starting today, and we'll do that every Wednesday. Usually it doesn't take this long to get to the moon, but there's a lot to talk about. So that's what we're going to try to cover in these sessions. I wanted to just thank everybody again for their support. And before we get into the meat of the dinner, I wanted to just thank the people who make this possible. And that would again be the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, their trade and investment office in New York. Professor Link is with us today through a contact there, and we really appreciate it. And we'll hear from him later. But they have been very supportive, and they are no doubt working very hard this week as the United Nations is in session here in New York, and they're probably stuck in traffic right now like everybody else. Also want to thank Kratos for their ongoing support for this as well, and Andre Jones and his team there. Special support comes from World Teleport Association, the only trade association in the world for operating teleports and ground segment providers and their partners around the world. So thanks to WTA, where things are always looking up. Our other partners that have been with us, New Space New York, Rice Space Institute at Rice University down in Houston, Dr. David Alexander, we appreciate his support, and the Washington Space Business Roundtable, our partner in this endeavor. And our special media partner, of course, Space News, and we'll be hearing from Jason Rainbow as we do every month in a few moments. He's joined us back here in the United States after a rigorous trip to Europe, which he'll tell us a little bit about. So again, thanks to everybody who makes this possible, and it wouldn't be possible without you. Okay, so we're going to go to the moon, but as we do every month, we're going to start things off with our special Better Satellite World video. So let's go to the tape, Matt.
We are going. The history of this agency is marked with broken barriers, once viewed as impossible, with science fiction turned reality, with innovations that have spun industries all their own, and with demonstrations of peace for all humankind.
We soar in the skies of our home planet. We maintain a human presence just outside of gravity, and we touch points all across the solar system and beyond. We're going back to the moon, and this is why.
The moon is a treasure trove of science.
It holds opportunities for us to make discoveries about our home planet, about our sun,
and about our solar system.
The wealth of knowledge to be gleaned from the moon will inspire a new generation of thought and action.
Without fail, every major program and mission NASA has invested in has led to technologies and capabilities that have shaped our culture.
The breakthroughs of the Artemis era will define our generation and the generations to follow.
The tens of thousands of jobs associated with propelling us to the moon today are just the beginning of a lunar economy that will see hundreds of thousands of new jobs develop around the world.
This is not an ambition of one entity or one country. The exploration of the moon is a shared effort.
Woven together by a desire for the greater good.
Why the moon?
because the missions of tomorrow will be sparked by the accomplishments of the Artemis generation today.
Because the ambition to go has already begun.
And because Mars is calling. We need to learn what it takes to establish a community on another cosmic shore.
You are on mute, Lou.
Okay, well, that's the case for going to the moon in a very emotional way, as our industry is good at doing. But does it really make the persuasive case? And is the world buying in? We'll find out as part of this series. Are we talking about high-flying pie in the sky? Or is this something that humanity is really destined to do? And so we'll be asking that hard question in a real way, which is what we always do here at the round table. So we'll be getting into that shortly. And at the end, we will be asking the big question. And you're in for a treat today, because the big question is going to be asked of someone who has been a space enthusiast since day one. And he is, I love to say this, the great actor Cass Anvar, who's with us today. So he's waiting anxiously to answer the question with the script from The Expanse as our guide. What is the one thing we need to do differently as we think about colonizing the moon? So if you're not familiar with The Expanse, watch it, while you can, or we'll tell you about it when we get to Cass. But we're delighted that he's going to be with us at the end of the show. To start us off, as we always do, we go to our friends at Space News and have a significant digits report. As always, we've got Jason Rainbow here. Jason has spent the last week or so in Europe. He was at World Satellite Business Week, working exhaustively there at that event. And he's got his report for us. His colleague, Deborah Werner, who's also usually with us, is still over there at the IAC, I believe. So Jason, you're going to fly solo to the moon with us today, but welcome. You don't look any jet lagged, so you look fresh and ready to go.
Oh,
Thanks
I'm glad to
again
hear it. Well, yeah, I definitely feel like I'm on the moon right now. It's getting harder and harder as I get older to deal with the old jet lag. But what a topic to help keep me awake. Thank you for inviting me on here.
Sure. How was Paris?
Busy. Yeah, good. A lot of discussion around the operator level consolidation we're seeing in the industry right now, with Viasat buying Inmarsat, Eutelsat buying OneWeb, and others that could jump on the bandwagon, and then also a lot of hype around this potential to provide connectivity from satellites directly to standard mobile phones. There's a lot of buzz around that. So yeah, plenty to write about. I have lots left to write too.
Yeah, did the subject of what we're talking about today, some of the economic development and startup activity in that cislunar space, between Earth and Moon, whether it's LEO or whatever?
Not so much that I saw, heard, but it is, activity here is definitely increasing, and we're starting to see a lot of announcements actually come out of IAC, which takes place this week. There's been quite a few already.
Jason, do you have a formal report to make, or should I?
I do, yeah.
Okay.
I had a look at what's going on.
Yeah, because I like being a reporter once in a while. It's hard work. But just one more question. As we head into the fourth quarter, what do you think will be the big story for the industry?
Well, I hope it's Artemis. I hope Artemis launches. We've been waiting far too long, so I hope that finally gets going, and we can move on to the next stage.
We'll all get our fingers crossed on that one. So over to you for the significant digits report.
Excellent. Yeah. So thanks. So despite the many delays in NASA's Artemis lunar exploration program, it has been driving a lot of investments in startups that see it as the start of an emerging lunar-based economy. And it comes amid growing activity in Cislunar, which could also potentially turn into a contested domain as countries seek access to lunar resources and stake out areas of jurisdiction. ahead of Artemis 3, the mission that will land astronauts on the moon in, I think, 2026, it looks like now. NASA's Commercial Lunar Payload Space Service Program, or CLPS, has been awarding contracts to commercial companies to send robotic spacecraft to the lunar surface. NASA has issued task orders for 8 missions to 5 companies under CLPS: Astrobotic Technology, Draper, Firefly Aerospace, Intuitive Machines, and Marston Space Systems. And about 4 years after this program was unveiled, these companies, some of them at least, are now finally getting close to flying their missions. And one announcement we did see last week, I think it was last week, Intuitive Machines announced plans to raise a significant amount of capital by going public through merging with a SPAC, showing there is still some interest or appetite for SPACs in the space industry despite a recent slowdown, and also underlying investor interest beyond GEO too. In fact, it's the first SPAC deal to be announced for a space company since early this year. Marston Space Systems, however, collapsed into bankruptcy in July. They struggled to get financing and develop technology against the backdrop of the pandemic and the industry's supply chain issues. That company was recently acquired, though, by fellow CLPS winner Astrobotic. So there's a lot of shuffling going around, happening right now as these early commercial efforts come to fruition. But the progress these pioneering missions make is going to be very important for how the private sector evolves around Cislunar and the moon, because alongside them, you also have the startups that are hoping to provide critical infrastructure that will create the foundation for future businesses beyond GEO. Startups like Aquarian Space and Plus Ultra Space Outposts are developing a communications network for the moon, for instance. Another startup called RIA Space Activity is developing an autonomous navigation module for Cislunar missions. And then there are those providing the financial foundations. I wrote a story earlier this year about how Japanese lunar land developer iSpace is negotiating the world's first insurance coverage for a commercial mission to the moon's surface. And while Artemis is led by the US, China, Russia, India, the UAE, and others also have their own dedicated moon programs. The bigger long-term goal in all of this, apart from the science and the development of robotic and other technologies, is to acquire lunar resources such as water ice and certain gases that can help support lunar bases and permanent space stations orbiting the moon, which is seen as a stepping stone to Mars and beyond. And also to the potential to diversify economies here on Earth, where mining, construction, energy, and other industries have shown early interest in becoming future customers for lunar products. This developing moon market is set to generate $105 billion over the next decade, according to analysts at Northern Sky Research. So there's a great deal of commercial activity in Cislunar and beyond, but we're still in the very early stages. There will likely be more delays and failures to come, but there appears to be a clear trajectory here, at least, I think.
Yeah, Jason, that's a great report and a snapshot. Obviously, you mentioned the pioneering efforts to build the infrastructure, putting the pieces in place. It's sort of like from 1492 to 1620 or 1640, right? It's sort of that period for us, it feels like. Just a quick question. Do SPACs get a reboot now, do you think, based on the Intuitive Machine deal, or is that just maybe a one-off, the last of a breed?
Yeah. I don't see it coming back the way it was. I think it was a particularly frantic, a special time for the industry. And because we've also seen SPACs disband, cancel their mergers. Right. There's been a few in space already. So But there is still appetite. It depends on the company and the deal, and never say never.
Yeah, right. Okay, well, thanks. And thanks also for talking about the developing moon market here on Earth, because I think that's going to be a big political question as well as anything else in a way to be able to make that case. What are you working on next? What can we look for from you in space news?
It's going to be direct to sell new entrants coming into this market. So we've seen Starlink and T-Mobile announce plans to provide connectivity directly to standard phones beyond the reach of cell towers.
Mm-hmm.
We have a number of startups, AST Space Mobile and Link Global, working on this. Global Star and Apple recently announced plans here, but there are others that I spoke to waiting in the wings to announce their plans. So I won't say any more than that until it's published. But exciting stuff.
You'll have to buy space news, won't you, to get Jason's work. Hey, Jason, thanks again. Welcome home. I'm sure the baby missed you. So get to that and get some rest.
Thank you.
Again, much appreciated.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Joe, things are moving along. I mean, it may be pie in the sky to some people, but that was a real substantial report. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Joe Fargnoli from the New York Space Alliance to get us going with a discussion. But what's your take on Jason's report to roll into today's discussion?
Yeah, first of all, Jason, thank you very much for that very insightful report. We like to call these companies you identified, we like to call the green shoots of the industry, right? They're just starting to sprout, just starting to come forward. So I really appreciate your presentation, Jason, to show us these points of light that are beginning to emerge. As we enter this discussion today, I'd like to ask our participants to consider the long-term view. Lou went all the way back to 1492. We happen to like the significance of that date from the standpoint of exploration of new worlds. I also like to look back at the summer of 1969 for a number of reasons, but one of which was the first landing on the moon. If we think about the progression of the space industry over the last 52 years and of humanity's progress over the last 500, we have a good base of example of how humans behave when we consider the opportunities to move into new worlds. And as we like to say, there are very few bad ideas, but there's lots of bad timing out there, okay? So part of the reason why we've dedicated this fall series to the development of the Cislunar Economy is because we're at the fruition point of perhaps a $30+ billion US government investment in the Artemis mission. Between Artemis and SLS, there's been a lot of capital and a lot of human resources put behind that. The US government is the best investor in long-term, high-risk ventures where it is not suitable for private capital. So the question is, what is the right rollout strategy for the post-Artemis world? Okay, we've heard the term Apollo orphans, where after the Apollo missions, we expected to have flying cars and be going to the moon on a commercial basis. That didn't happen. There was an Apollo winter, basically, that happened. Commercially, of course, a lot of great things happened in LEO, but we didn't take that next great leap that we expected we would take. So what's going to be different this time? How do we properly understand the post-Artemis mission world and the role of private capital in that and the potential for public-private partnership? So the purpose of this series is for us to have discussions, for us to consider this and look at the opportunities. We hope we can be a guiding influence in the way private capital comes to the cislunar space. And I think you're going to see some upcoming events that we're going to be doing that will create more of a forum for that. But for today, we've put together a very highly esteemed panel of experts to engage in this conversation with us. And as we like to say, this is a New York conversation. We are raw, we are real. We want to talk about the actual issues. That's why our title for the program is called, is Cislunar pie in the sky? Are we going to have another Apollo winter? Are investors going to invest too early and be left high and dry? Our hope is for a robust, productive economy that provides peace and prosperity for humankind going forward, but we're going to have to do things a little bit differently. And we're going to explore that in this series. But for today, our three esteemed panelists, I'd like to first introduce Dr. Matthias Link. He is the director and member of the executive committee at the Luxembourg Space Agency, the LSA. He works on the definition and implementation of Luxembourg's space sector development policy with a focus on international affairs, legal and regulatory issues, public research and education, as well as finance and innovation. Prior to his current job at LSA, Matthias occupied a similar function at the former Directorate of Space Affairs within the Luxembourg Ministry of the Economy, as well as at Lux Innovation and the National Agency for Innovation and Research. And before I go on, I just want to laud Luxembourg as being one of the smaller countries in space, but disproportionately large in terms of their willingness to explore the future of space. And Dr. Link can probably talk to us about some of those endeavors and how they look at this. Next, I'd like to introduce a friend of mine and a very well-known entrepreneur in the new space economy, Mr. Robert Brumley. He is currently the co-founder and chairman of the Comstar Space Companies. He brings an executive experience in the management and financing of early stage ventures, particularly in aerospace, telecommunications, and defense. In June 2020, Bob and his colleagues at Marble Arch Partners, LLC, and the executive team at Laserlight Companies announced the launch of Comstar Space Communications, or Comstar. I can go into a long description of that. I'm going to leave it to Bob to do, but know that Bob is an experienced veteran in the new space economy, and we're really pleased to have him with us today. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Adrian Guzman, who works at the International Relations and Space Security Coordination at the Mexican Space Agency, where he is the Director of Earth Observation and Space Exploration. At the International Space Exploration Coordination Group, an entity of 27 space agencies, he co-leads the Emergent Space Agencies and Commercialization Working Group. So as you see, we've got a very esteemed panel here with really great backgrounds from national government policy formation to the actual act of carrying out pragmatic entrepreneurship. So we hope for a really robust conversation. To kick that off, we've shared a couple of potential questions with our panelists, and I want to kind of stimulate the conversation with the first question. This is really the most obvious question, right? What is the national strategic value of going to the moon and developing cislunar space, given the challenges that we face on Earth of a not fully peaceful or prosperous Earth right now? Why is it important for the US to have a strong presence in the cislunar economy? Why is it important for the US to do this in light of what its near-peer rivals are doing, China and Russia, for example, and others? Is it just national pride? Is it a high-tech game of capture the flag? Or is there real strategic value in terms of promoting peace and prosperity for humankind? And how would we possibly consider going about this in a way that will be beyond what we did in the post-Apollo era? So to start this off, I want to turn to my colleague, Bob Brumley. Bob, how would you approach kicking off the conversation around this big question?
Well, I think it's a very, very simple question, and in one sense, and that is innovation is better than duplication. If you innovate, you get all the value associated with the innovation, which is both the ecosystem, which includes human capital, private capital, and also institutional support. If you're a duplicator, you're not really behind the R&D, all the dirty little work that the federal labs do and government programs do and the private sector do. You basically go take it at the application stage. And when you do that, you've lost that ecosystem. You just sort of hang there. So innovators lead duplicators, and innovators, especially in science and technology and the space program specifically, they drive what would be the spin-outs. And then the spin-outs help quality of life, standard of living, and essentially drive your economy. So I think it's more than capture the flag. It is maintaining market position. It's maintaining innovation leadership in the world. It's also, at some point, it maintains our security, because the innovator will always have greater security capability than the duplicator.
Great. Going around, Dr. Link, how would you address that question?
Yeah, thank you, Joe. And by the way, thank you very much for inviting me to this interesting roundtable and for the great introduction. I think a lot of things have already been said on the opportunity actually that's out there. So what I can talk about, of course, is why a company like Luxembourg is considering also going into cislunar space and also to the moon. You might know that we started being active in space in the 1980s with the creation of SCS that evolved to a huge geostationary and actually multi-orbit communication provider, and that worked out very well. And so we looked at commercial space very early, let's say, when even at that time, not everyone believed in it. And what we have just seen over past years is that right now, space is expanding. The commercial ecosystem of space is expanding towards cislunar space with many initiatives in many countries, a lot of private companies being interested as well. And so we felt that the time was ripe to also consider this in the same way than we considered it earlier. So for us, of course, in general, in responding to your question, there's the huge scientific value, let's say, in going to the moon and beyond, in further exploring and understanding our solar system. I think that scientific value is very clear and also makes a very strong reason, let's say, for agencies to go there. But on top of that, and it has been well summarized by Jason before, and I don't repeat this, there's a huge economic value out there. And it's obvious that it will not come from today to tomorrow. It's a longer term game, but it's very clear that it's coming. And so as a country addressing commercial space, Luxembourg is positioning itself on it, and of course together with our European partners, trying to progress with all the different players here and make sure that we capture this value.
Thank you, Dr. Link. Dr. Guzman?
Well, I really appreciate the comments from Robert and Matthias, because it's a very nice introduction of what is happening in Mexico. I mean, Mexico is an emerging space nation, and we need partners. I mean, we cannot do it by our own, and the commercial initiatives like LEAPS are opening these gates to countries like mine. You know? I mean, the first lunar mission of Mexico is actually taking place with astrobotics, you know, and this is going to be our first lunar mission right now. I mean, this is the right time to do it. I mean, for countries like mine, it's we cannot wait another 60 years in order to start thinking what we're going to do in terms of space development and technology, much more because there is a rich environment, you know, economically speaking, for countries like mine. And also, I completely agree with Bob. I mean, we're pretty much like a small business enterprise. I mean, not Mexico, but in terms of technological development. I mean, we can take the liberty to explore on innovations, something that large companies cannot do. So if we focus on innovation, I think we can have something to propose, and much more if we gain the momentum with other emerging space agencies. There's some knowledge that we don't have, but that is well developed in other countries. But in a certain sense, we can contribute with small initiatives that can be significant. Our first lunar mission is less than 1 kilogram. So it's taking us to the moon. And that's a lot of money saving, you know? And that's just making presence of Mexico and what we would like to do in the future. But at the same time, it's opening the eyes and the opportunities to enterprise, to companies that are only focused on the Earth container, you know? And cislunar orbits are basically empty spaces that we need to fill with things that are required, like communications, for example. And communications are strategically for any country, you know? So Mexico can contribute a little bit with that in innovation, in capacity building. And we are taking the advantage of working with other space agencies, but also with companies. I mean, that's a new game player, you
know? Joe, can I jump in here?
Please, Luke.
Just want to follow up on these great opening remarks. Bob, I'm going to circle back to you and tie this, I think, back to questions for Dr. Link and Dr. Guzman. From the private sector side, when you wax eloquently about innovation, you know, we all sort of subscribe to that. I guess the question then is, how does that innovation lead now to a more practical approach for economic development, for development for companies like yours that then drive local regional economies, which at the end of the day sort of justify the effort to go forward in the public mind? And what kind of innovations are we actually going to be looking at from companies like yours?
Well, to kind of summarize at least the front end of that is, what's the economic benefit for these types of programs locally within our own communities? Obviously you follow the money. Okay, that's it. You just follow the money. If the money flows into NASA and NASA programs, NASA has been very successful over the last 65 years of spreading what would be their center philosophy all over the country, and also sharing in academic institutions, which means the money flows into programs like CLIPS is a good example. You follow the money. You've created what would be landers. Well, those landers are not being built by NASA. They're being built by private companies. Right. But NASA has de-risked an element of that by becoming an anchor tenant. Now, then you look at the other side of the people who are employed by Astrobotics or Intuitive Machines. Those are not NASA employees. Those are people that were hired. They may have been NASA employees. In fact, I had a conversation with a senior NASA official talking to me about how hard something we were trying to do in Cislunar. And they said, it's really hard. We train for this. It takes months for us to do this. How can you do that? I said, we'll just hire your people. And we'll pay them more money, and it'll still be hard, but we'll have people who can do it. So you're seeing a translation of talent going into not just the spacefaring states like Florida, but they're going abroad, and companies and countries are coming here to basically mix both graduate students right out of school, people who are working in space programs, people who are working in affiliated programs, but also the finance community. I can tell you what, 10 years ago, you couldn't find a banker on Wall Street that knew what LEO, GEO, and MEO were. You could probably find a few at JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley, but basically space was just, quote, a communications place, right? Today, they know what Cislunar is, they know what those three markets are, et cetera. You follow the money. And the money has a gravity to it, and it pulls both communities, institutions, employees back into it. The key here with this is, last point, is that someday, unlike Apollo, someday that you can't count on the Artemis money. And I'm not being critical. You just can't count on it.
That's my point.
So you got to wean off what would be, I'm part of the Artemis program, to we're going, as the ad said, except it's the private sector is going to go. And it'll be smaller, more efficient, more focused on with respect to the number of employees and COGS and things like that. But you can tell now it's not crazy to start a company up and say, we're going to the moon. How are you going to do it? We're going to the moon because we've got a plan and we know how to do it. We'll hire the right people. And it's totally unrelated to selling or being part of Artemis. That's huge. And that's the difference between Apollo.
So essentially, we've moved from the government as the enabler of a market to a market itself. Mm-hmm. So that Luxembourg and Mexico will take advantage of this market growth and activity to raise its own economies. And I want to ask those two guys some questions. But just the last question, you said something interesting about the innovation following money. Now, Mike Bloomberg, who used to be mayor of New York and had a small company called Bloomberg, always used to say that money follows ideas. So innovations follow markets too, don't they, Bob?
Absolutely, they follow markets. And it's if you're looking at private innovation, Bloomberg is right. I mean, there's got to be a market, right? And then you go and innovate to go after that market share. In the government context, there is an overwhelming aspirational government mission. Okay, and then the innovation goes to support the mission, and then the taxpayers support it. So depending on, Bloomberg's correct, is that if you see an opportunity to basically open a bodega someplace, you're going to do it. You're going to go to the bank and get the money to do it. On the other hand, if you're out with some particularly government-backed program, you got to do it their way and their rules, and also how they want to do it relative to spending the money. One is they're just two different business models, but you end up in the middle. You still end up with either government or the private sector going in that direction. And it's just lately, it's more private sector loosening its ties to government that's driving this.
Right, right. So Dr. Link, what he's describing is the government moving from enabler to sort of policymaker to continue the innovation in the private sector. I have to ask you, with regard to Luxembourg, as Joe said, very small country, but way out ahead on this issue. And is that because Luxembourg, like Taiwan, said, hey, you know, in the modern digital economy, this economy we're in, size doesn't matter. Innovation matters, to quote Bob Brumley. Is that what's going on in Luxembourg? Are you guys saying, we don't care, we don't need to be the size of Russia or the United States? Luxembourg's fine the way it is, and we know how to innovate.
Yes, I would start by saying we had, of course, we were lucky that we had an extremely success with the satellite communication, in the satellite communications world. So in Luxembourg, even though we are small, with that specific company, we saw that we can bring in private investors and build a highly successful company. And this awareness of being able to do this, even as a smaller country, is very much, is very general in Luxembourg. The population is very well aware of this. And so there is a high political support for developing the space sector. The space sector in Luxembourg is in relative terms enormous. I mean, we are probably among the top 5 or so in the world in terms of relative importance of that sector. And so there was a great acceptance now also to look into new and future activities. And I would like to say, talking about Artemis, but maybe also about the plans of SpaceX or Blue Origin, these provide direction. These provide a general feeling that we go into this, in this direction, and that this will come. And even though, of course, there are great challenges, I usually speak of 4 challenges. There's, of course, the technological challenge that still needs to be solved. And many technologies need to be matured. We need innovation in that domain. There's a legal and regulatory challenge, which is a challenge on its own, and we'll probably address it here as well. We need some international framework also. There's the financial challenge, of course, and that's especially important for Luxembourg because we know that we will need private investors here. So we need to speak to these investment communities as well to bring them in. And then there's the business challenge, and it has been said, we are talking about markets that do not exist. And these 4 challenges are extremely interrelated because, of course, you will not find an investor investing in markets that do not exist with unclear legal framework and technology that is not mature. But the thing is, and that's basically the decision that we took in Luxembourg, also for the Cislunar and future lunar economies, is that we are willing to progress step by step and try to solve what we can solve on a daily business, year by year, trying to progress. And that is definitely something we have seen now in the past years. We launched an initiative on the utilization of space resources, which will be fundamental in establishing future markets, for example, on the moon in 2016. And back then, we felt pretty much alone in Europe with that topic. It felt for most of the European countries, at least, like total science fiction and very early actually to consider. And this has completely changed. Now there's so much talk about this specific field everywhere. And so we feel more and more confident that this is actually the right path. And maybe one last point here, which is extremely important for us. Of course, you cannot only consider these future markets, which do not yet exist. So what we put a very strong emphasis on is to find companies that share this long-term view on addressing future markets, for example, on the moon, but also have the means or the technology or innovative spirit to address existing markets in space or on the terrestrial side with similar technologies. And this we have already done quite successfully. We have a few companies that do exactly this, and we're able to get investments. We also work with larger companies, like, for example, Air Liquide, which is a leading gas provider, European gas provider, also interested in future lunar economies, which is actually investing in this field. So we clearly see an interest, and this is year by year this interest is growing.
Yeah, and Jason was right about that element. And again, Luxembourg out ahead of the pack, understanding the value of this, it sounds like. Adrian, you were nodding your head as both of these guys were talking, and particularly Dr. Link. What does Mexico need to get there, to get to the point now where it's building this innovation ecosystem and is able to go out and attack this presumed market in a way that makes it, similar to Luxembourg?
Well, I can tell you, Lou, that definitely, I mean, Mexico is in a very challenging time. I mean, we only have one Mexican space agency, which is the equivalent of NASA or any other space agency in any other nation. But we have very, very huge restricted and budget cuts, in Mexico. So we need to start to think how to convince the government that what we were doing was something valuable, something good, but at the same time, we couldn't stop our own plans. I mean, our own mission thinking and science in a certain degree of development. I come from the private sector. I mean, I have to basically finance my own stuff in order to make the things that I like, So I used to work with banks, and when my boss used to tell me, like, Adrian, how we can finance this or how we can go ahead with this mission or plan ahead, I say, well, we just have one mission, lunar mission, that we managed to get funds from the government and from a research university, but our second lunar mission can be a public-private partnership. That's one of the things that we are doing. But at the same time, we need to approach the money as Bob says. No, I mean, we need to generate these ideas, thinking that there's going to be some sort of return of investment in order to convince the government that these are the right things to do. I can see more money on space for Mexico than tourism, for example, but nobody's going to believe me. No, I mean, I need to try to convince them, because Mexico is a tourism place, but we are right next to the US. So we can produce more than what we are thinking. And when I approach people with money in order to ask, like, hey, maybe you can found a little piece of this, I need to talk to them in a very plain way, not like space thinking. The most simple and common questions that come from people with money that we approach are the most significant for us. A guy with a telecommunications company told us something like, are there cell phone towers in the moon that can be there? And I say, well, the weight, everything, it's impossible, no? But we can try to rethink the same function of that cell phone tower in a different way, and maybe that can be your Mexican contribution.
Yeah, it goes back to the Brumley doctrine of innovation, it sounds like, again. Thank you for that. Joe, asking for money, the eternal question, huh? Back to you.
Yeah, it sure is. I think Tamara is shortly going to pull out the cane here and bring us to a conclusion. But before she does that, I just want to take a sharp right turn here in the conversation and consider the human value of cislunar exploration. A quote that I have that I like states, the well-being of mankind, its peace and security are unattainable unless and until unity is firmly established. So every time mankind has taken a large leap, there's been the opportunity to do things a little bit differently, okay? So my question is, as we look to leap into cislunar space, how do we reboot the human psychology about how we achieve human unity and really usher forward a true era of peace and prosperity? I know that sounds like pie in the sky, but that's pie I'm willing to reach for. And my question is, what are your thoughts on that? And let's just go around, starting with Dr. Link.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. That's a tough question, frankly. And I of course hope that we'll do things differently in space. And I'm a very optimistic person in general, so I'm let's say, a bit optimistic that we will be able to do it. But of course, humans are humans, and there's also risk that we will just redo the same errors that we did in the past in space. What I can say is, again, a bit what we have seen over the past years in engaging on a national level, multilateral level, and also international level on exactly these kind of things, on how to ensure that we come in the medium term, let's say, to an international framework that prevents these problems that we had in the past in similar resource-related, let's say, topics. So there is, of course, the international framework, which is driven by United Nations, which is slow, but also going into the right direction, I would say. Just a few years ago, the COPUOS, which is the main committee at United Nations dealing with space, started addressing the topic of space resource utilization, for example, and there was tremendous opposing views, let's say, on that question. And this was just 5 years ago. This has calmed down, even though the geopolitical situation has not become easier. I think now everyone actually agrees that this is coming and it's unavoidable, and it will actually bring great benefits also to humankind. And so the thing is, of course, that we need an international framework. But again, the positive thing is that everyone agrees on that. There's no one saying that we don't need an international framework. Everyone is saying we need it. And of course, we need to be careful in building it. We also need this framework to be adaptive, because as I said before, many things are still unclear. Many challenges need to be solved. So we need a framework that is also able to adapt to this evolving field in terms of technology, in terms of finance, in terms of markets. And again, then what I also consider positive is that real work has already begun. There have been multilateral efforts such as the Hague Space Resource Working Group, where Luxembourg was also very much engaged, which is a group of different experts from different disciplines, legal, but not only. We had legal persons, we had engineers, scientists, economics, to lay already the foundation of such future frameworks. And this work has been widely acknowledged also by the UN. And we have the Artemis Accords, which I think we already mentioned, which also start laying a frame for such a future framework where many countries have become members already. And then even at the UN, there's also practical work moving forward, because we just last year approved the creation of a working group on space resource utilization to start addressing these different topics. So even though the geopolitical context is very difficult and will certainly not make it easier, at least we have this very large awareness or acknowledgement that we need an international framework. So I think we need to stay positive, but of course there's no guarantee that this will be easy.
Thank you, Dr. Link. Adrian, then we'll go to Bob, and I'm going to be off camera here for a moment, but listening intently.
Well, I really believe, Joseph, that obviously to have a psychological framework in space is definitely one of the needs for exploration. I mean, but at the same time, each new step that we give on exploration, first with human systems like robotic systems, where our mind is actually embedded in these systems, is taking us a little bit further, you know. And I truly believe that humanity itself needs to start thinking outside the box, and the box is the Earth, you know. I mean, and start to think in a new identity framework of what is beyond the Earth, you know. I mean, in exploration. I used to have a professor in Canada who told me that when you lose identity, you become violent, you know. So the identity framework, I mean, to construct this new identity in space exploration is foundational. I mean, it could be a Mexican, it could be people from any place in Europe, from the United States. I mean, when you're outside the Earth. I mean, outside any boundary. In cislunar space, we have a void. I mean, and communications are basically the fundamental points of reference for that psychological framework. So there are many challenges to take in consideration. I have a small conversation with two astronauts in NASA a couple of weeks ago, one Italian and one Japanese, and they told me that outside they don't feel like from any nation, you know, and that they don't have this belonging, you know, and I think it's going to be pretty much we start moving forward. I mean, so this psychological framework is fundamental for new culture creation and new technological development. And I believe in humanity. I mean, I truly believe we are going to surpass that sort of challenge. I'm working with 27 people from different countries around the world, so and I don't see like any difference between us when we do stuff, you know. So that's pretty much my sense.
Bob, over to you with that last question. Adrian's an optimist, but he says we need to change. And Cass Ambar, I think, will probably pile onto that a little bit when we get there.
Yeah, I'm not a theologian, and I am not a anthropologist. I have studied history, and I will tell you the world. I mentioned innovators and duplicators, but the conflict side of that is there are builders and then there are takers. And unfortunately, we have a history going as far back as you can see what is on the walls in the caves in France of either hunter-gatherers or those who build villages, and then the hunter-gatherers come and basically raid the villages. Not to give you a Conan the Barbarian snippet, but that's kind of it. So how do you translate or prevent that from being in Cislunar or on the moon or on Mars? And that may dovetail into the expanse discussion here toward the end. I think you have to be prepared for it because I don't see a way around it. If we have conflict on this planet, unless we're all mutually sharing oxygen, habitation, and sustenance. So like on a space station, you do have a Japanese astronaut and a European astronaut. They're all mutually dependent on each other. Can't really go, except for the Russians who went to their own little habitation and shut the door and said, we don't want to talk to you. Other than that, I see on a practical standpoint that you're not going to avoid conflict in space. On the other hand, you need rules of the road, and the rules of the road have to have some bite into it. Bite meaning if it's two hearts and minds, you really have the Antarctica Treaty, which is, okay, that's great. There's no economic development down there, and there's probably a good reason for it. But it's great because there's nothing bad happening there. On the other hand, if you put the Antarctica Treaty on the moon, it isn't going to be recognized. No one's going to sign up for that because the whole opportunity, even that one article that came out the other day with the Chinese crystal, that Chinese crystal may be nothing more than worth $5 in a pawn shop in New Jersey. But the fact that Chinese found the crystal on the dark side of the moon, it has such cachet that, gosh, could that be a diamond? What happened if they brought back a 50-pound diamond? That would destroy the diamond market, but then we'd make a lot of money. I know that sounds kind of silly, but there's builders and then there are takers. There's entrepreneurs and then there are others. And I'm just going to say, if you don't have something that is enforceable and you keep everyone basically not in their own sector, like Antarctica, but you keep everyone that bad actors are punished, either on the Earth or punished somewhere else, you're going to have 19th century colonialism, and it's not going to be pretty. Is that a nice balance between the
no, that's good. Somebody give me a drink too, but that's a real answer. Joe, that's a real answer. I'm going to turn this over to Tamara now because we've got a bunch of questions, including one from an Industry Hall of Fame inductee, Ed Horowitz. So Tamara, I'm going to turn it over to you to see if we can get as many questions as we can in before we get to future events and then the big question.
Absolutely. And we have a whole bunch of questions. I'm very excited that there's a lot going on in the chats. I encourage our panelists to turn their attention to the chats because we're not going to get to all the questions in time. But Ed asks us, He says, do private sector missions fly under a nation's flag? What are the rules to set territory and non-interference? And so I'm going to throw that out to the panel. I'm going to ask everybody to be succinct because I actually have 3 more questions. I don't think I'm going to get to them, but let's give it a shot.
Matthias, you want to pick that up first?
Yep. Can't hear you, Matthias. There you go.
Sorry, I didn't get the question, actually. I started looking in the chat, but
oh, no, I'll read it to you. So it says again, do private sector missions fly under a nation's flag? What are the rules to set territory and non-interference?
Picking up on what Bob was saying. Yeah.
No, so what can be said is, because I saw that there's a question also on the Outer Space Treaty. So what is clear today, and that's one of the uncontested things of the Outer Space Treaty, private missions need to be authorized by a country, by a government. And this is actually also what we have done in Luxembourg by having a first law on space resource utilization, similar to the one that the US enacted in 2015. And in the meantime, you have similar laws also in Japan and in the Emirates. So this is for a certain start that governments can actually authorize private sector missions, also going to the moon and start utilizing resources. But as I said before, this is definitely not sufficient. We need an international framework which will gradually follow also the real operations that will build up gradually on the moon. So I'm not sure this answers the questions, but maybe partly.
Yeah.
Not sure there is an answer. Adrian, you want to pick that up?
Well, yes, I can say that, I mean, we are moving to a completely new environment. I mean, the space is boundless. It doesn't have the same physical dimension. I mean, we are used to see things like this. I mean, four walls, squares, and we need to think that in space anything counts. You know, I used to have a colleague and a professor in the United States. I have the great opportunity to live and study in 10 different countries, who wrote an excellent book about what the market state was, you know, or could be, you know, theoretically speaking. And I believe that we are having the opportunity right now to approach this boundless space as a market space as well. I mean, we need to think that I agree with Bob. I mean, there's going to be bad actors anyway, in every place, but at the same time there's always going to be needs. I mean, needs for consumption, needs to eat, need to communicate, need to live. I mean, and we just need to translate these needs into a new boundless space and start to reconfigure these scenarios and find a way to do it in a regulated space, as Matthias just said. I mean, Luxembourg, Japan, and the United States are far ahead, I mean, in their regulatory framework and aspect, because you have like 10 years at least or more thinking and acting on this way. And we need to follow that way of thinking, because this is unstoppable. I mean, if it's now or if it's in 10 years, we are going to do it. I mean, the human species needs to find the new places, the new scenarios to create, to live, to act, and also to trade. So at the end, we cannot deny our humanity in that sense. So I'm still an optimist, but I agree with Bob. And I mean, I work for the government, so at the end, so I need to say that everything needs to be well established as a games of
for the record,
about 30 seconds to respond.
Okay, for the record, I'm not a pessimist. I'm a realist, and that's just Secondly, as to the answer to the question is every state has to, every satellite originating from a launching state has to have a launch license.
Correct.
And that way it would carry their flag and their regulatory requirements. You can't go up and do, shall I say, Bitcoin illegal transactions on the moon and think no one's watching you. You are subject to whatever that launch state license and that body of law would be.
Right. So we still are creatures who need to adhere to law to be more than the other creatures, right?
Yeah, let's hope that's hopeful. Yes, that's
there you go. You know, Dr. Guzman's got us so optimistic here, and, you know,
and just
you're balancing us.
Look at it this way: the world that we're all in is between Asimov and Orwell, and we all kind of glide in between the two. That's all.
Okay, so that's good. So fortunately, Columbus didn't sail on behalf of Coca-Cola. He sailed on behalf of Spain and the Catholic Church. So we probably got a better outcome. Thank you, gentlemen. That was terrific. We're going to do this again. We're going to get to our big question, though, because I think we teed it up beautifully for Cass. Before I do that, though, Matt, I want to just tell people what's coming up next. And I'm going to go through this very quickly. Next month, third Wednesday of the month, it's the New York Space Business Roundtable. We're going to continue on this conversation, opportunities and why. And then in November, Joe and I will be asking the question, so you think you want to be an entrepreneur? And we'll have entrepreneurs on and people who guide entrepreneurs, and to see how many more Bob Brumleys we can create for the industry, or how many are being created. So that'll be next month. You can register for that now by going to sspi.org/events and going to those dates. Next slide. The SSPI WISE organization will be meeting tomorrow at 2 p.m. If you're a woman in the industry, we certainly encourage you to join in. We'll have Lori Garver, who's the founder and CEO of Earthrise Alliance, as the speaker there, and you can quickly glance the topic. And that's 2 p.m. Eastern time. And next month, we'll be out in Silicon Valley for our Future Leaders Celebration. We'll be celebrating 20 people under 35 who are changing the course of the industry, and we'll be picking up on a lot of the ideas and notions that we've shared here today. So again, you can register for that, buy a table, buy a ticket, be a sponsor, but celebrate the future, which again is something SSPI is insistent that we do. And you can always do more with SSPI. We've got our Space Business Qualified course for people who want to learn more about the industry and be space business certified. We've got our podcast every Monday on Apple or Spotify or SSPI. We encourage you to listen to that. We're going through a group of entrepreneurial companies now and interviewing them. And then in the future, we'll tell you more about Astropreneurship Day in New York and what Joe and I and Tamara have in mind for that. So that's what's going on in the future, and we appreciate you being a part of it. But let's stay in the present now and ask the big question. I'd like to quickly welcome the Expanse star and actor Cass Anvar, who's with us today with a t-shirt that, if you can't read it, says "Wage Peace." So I think we know where he's coming from, and it just gives me a great thrill to welcome him. He is the penultimate enthusiast from the artistic side of the world of our industry. Cass Anvar, great to see you, man. Thanks for coming. I think you're on mute.
The penultimate enthusiast. I don't think that word has ever been attributed to me, and I love it. What an amazing, mind-blown experience to listen to everyone talk today. I wanted to address the question, which is what can be, where can we go, I guess, that but using the show's world as a kind of a base.
That script for the Expanse. The reason we thought of this is that script for the Expanse almost addresses every issue from that last question Joe asked, doesn't it? And you lived it.
I kind of feel that, Robert, you were a consultant on the show based on how the show came together in terms of its worldview and what you were describing, because I feel you are a realist, and I feel that the show depicts maybe not what we hope will happen, but what would likely happen. It's incredibly gritty and real, and it's very corporate driven. One thing they got right, I feel, in terms of my worldview, is that they unified planet Earth. The Earth has become its own entity. It's a unified world. And however, I feel like the cynical side of that is the only reason it did unify was because they now have Mars and Belters and the moon. They have colonies of which to focus their competitive nature. I think we would want to do better than the Expanse. That's my view. Is I think we should do better, and I think we're capable of doing better. I think the human race is very fear-based. We're very reactionary, and I feel like, and I'll rephrase that. I don't think we're fear-based. I think we're survival-based, and survival generates a lot of fear. And if it's manipulated in the right way, that fear and that need for survival can be directed into conflict. I do feel that need for survival can be directed into something that's more kind of in tune with what my shirt says. We have a very powerful energy. And my proof for that is what just happened to us in the pandemic. The entire planet was attacked. And for the first time in the history of the world, we unified as a species. There was some conflict, there was some disagreements. Not everyone unified as well as they should, but we did unify as a species to come to something that has never happened in the world. Like, we got a vaccine out in basically a year. That's never happened, ever. And we put aside all our red tape, because we wanted to save our own lives. That to me is the power of humanity. And it doesn't come from governments, it doesn't come from leaders, it doesn't come from the governmental structures, it comes from the people, like that basic human instinct. I feel like we are starting to get it right with the Artemis project. Although it's a gesture, I think it's a good gesture, getting the first woman and the first person of color onto the moon. It's a great statement. I think the pandemic revealed some of the best qualities of humanity and some of the worst. There was uprisings and justice outrage because we were put in a position where we were not able to distract ourselves with the day-to-day humdrum activities of life to occupy ourselves, like earning a living and going to work and staying on the subway. We were stuck at home thinking. And as a result, our passions got activated, and some crazy stuff happened as a result of being put under siege. I feel that power can be channeled. I feel with charismatic leaders, powerful people, and a switch in our incentives. Right now, our incentives, and Robert, I'll challenge that. Realism is I feel we are bubble thinkers, and our bubble is about 10 to 20 years in either direction. We think about our family, and we think about 10, 20 years in the future, 10, 20 years in the past. That's reality because we're living it. But I feel like the optimism or something a little bit grander would be to expand that bubble to maybe 100 years, 200 years back and forth. And if we can all as a society, it would eliminate racism, it will eliminate sexism, it will eliminate classism, which didn't get eliminated in the show. Yes, we unified as a planet, but we now have started exploiting belters, skinnies, and we started having conflict with Mars, who we call dusters. We're constantly us and theming, we're constantly othering. And that's a human trait. And I guarantee you, if we were invaded by an alien species, we would unify, we would collaborate, and Independence Day would probably happen. There would probably be some people like Putin vying for power and wanting to come out on top, but we would unify as a species to combat the mutual threat. All of our differences would disappear until the threat is gone. these powers I feel can be harnessed. Go ahead.
So having said that, Cass, the big question is what, based on the script, based on how you developed your character, thought about what the writers were putting in front of you, what you were developing there during the show, what do we need to do differently to avoid the scenarios that you described where, you know, nothing, they say nothing so concentrates the mind as the prospect of the noose, but you don't want to be walking toward the gallows before you do the right thing. Is there something that you've arrived at that would prevent that based on that experience?
I mean, fear is incredibly motivating. I'm just going to say fear is incredibly motivating. And I was kind of inspired by the things that were taking place as a result of the pandemic. The fear generated a unification. What we would do differently, I mean, we have to make choices that are not short-term. The world has created a reward system that rewards short-term goals. We have created a disposable culture. It's more profitable. Profit has become our pagan god. And as a result, everything is driven towards profit, which is a detriment to our world. For example, in the show, we exploited the people that ended up going out in the belt, the people that end up on the asteroids. We've been doing that since Egypt. We've been doing that since the time of the pharaohs. We've been doing that for thousands of years, slave labor. And that can't happen if we're going to move forward and progress as a species. When we go to the moon, I've personally had the privilege of being introduced to some amazing robotics companies in my forays into the space world. There are some incredible mining and drilling robots that I've seen that are going to the moon or are planning to go to the moon. And that's going to take all the hardship away for the most part. I mean, there's still going to have to be human beings that are running them, but you're not going to create this incentivized economy, hopefully, towards slave labor of human beings. Once we diminish human beings and make them and create this classism, it just invites division, it invites exploitation, and we're just going to photocopy what we have on Earth and put it on the moon. And I don't feel that should happen. Artemis is great. We're changing the equation. We're saying, you know, people of color and women are at the forefront of humanity as it should be. We've got to also get rid of classism. Right now, space and the space industry is a very classist endeavor. It's hugely expensive, and people who are just average, everyday Joe Blows can't really conceive of actually participating in anything that involves space exploration unless there's a benefactor, which I think Space for Humanity is doing right now, trying to get people out there to viewe the overview effect, which I think is another amazing thing. And that's another great thing that I think will help us unify.
We want to get a reaction now, Kaz, but was there any episode of The Expanse where you would say, yeah, you know, Adrian Guzman's optimism, Bob Brumley's realism, Matthias's link, you know, practical approach to all of this kind of came together, and it's the world we would want to live in as we go forward? And any episode we need to watch or you can think of?
There are a couple of episodes in the second and third season where Ceres Station is under attack by the protomolecule creatures, and the Expanse crew goes in to rescue them, and we are discovering the conspiracy. We are discovering that this entire thing has been weaponized by a private organization, by a corporation, and has been experimented on innocent people in the working class. And I think we can all relate that to actual historical events that have happened in our history, where large groups of people were experimented on either for military purposes or for biological and medical purposes without their consent. And we have the heroes of our show discover this and then take action to expose it to the world. The world is made aware of this horrible thing that has been happening. And that creates a viral, I mean, that's the expansive version of the internet. And that creates a viral wave that ends up getting justice for the actions that took place. The systems that are in place kind of, they capture the person responsible, he's put in jail, and the heroes end up going in and trying to save as many innocent people as they can. And it's symbolic, but it's a symbol, it's an allegory for the little man, because we're nobody. We're a bunch of janitors and scientists, and we go in there and we save a few dozen people, and we take them onto the ship, and we rescue them and expose the lie, expose the truth. And then from that, a series of dominoes happen from just a few people